Manningtree, Essex. The year is 1645. A lawyer's clerk named Matthew Hopkins, a man in his mid-twenties with a strict manner and a heavy Puritan coat, sits down to dictate a pamphlet that will change the landscape of English history. He titles it The Discovery of Witches. Listen to what he wrote to defend his own bloody work. Certain queries answered, which have been and are likely to be objected against Matthew Hopkins in his way of finding out witches. He wrote this because the towns were beginning to ask questions. The magistrates were beginning to balk at his fees. The people who had cheered him as their savior were beginning to wonder if the sickness he cured was less than the sickness he caused. And the worst part isn't the arrogance of the pamphlet, or the money he made, or the 100 souls he sent to the gallows in just over 14 months. The worst part is the quiet, bureaucratic order of it all. This was not a mob with pitchforks. This was the law of the land. Welcome to History for Sleepyheads. Tonight we are stepping back into the early modern world, not the Dark Ages, not the medieval era of knights and castles. We are walking into the age of the printing press, the age of Shakespeare's immediate successors, the age of the English Civil War. We are looking at the real history of the witch trials. It is a subject steeped in myth. In Hollywood films and Halloween caricatures, the witch is a monster, and the townspeople are a screaming frenzy. But the truth is much quieter and much more methodical. The horror of the witch trials is not that they were chaotic. It is that they were an ordinary administrative process. It was a court of assizes. It was a sworn jury. It was an itemized bill of 20 shillings per town. Close your eyes. Let the modern world fall away. The screens, the traffic, the urgent lights of today, let them all dissolve. We are walking down a dirt lane in East Anglia. It is night. The air is damp, carrying the smell of wet wool, of cold wood smoke, of turned earth. Somewhere in the dark there is the slow, steady drip of water, a single drop falling from the eaves of a thatched roof into a puddle below, a quiet, patient clock. Drip, drip, drip. This is a journey into how a community consumes itself, how a quiet village, struggling with a failed harvest or a sick calf, begins to look at the older woman at the edge of the woods and wonders. Once they wonder, the gaze hardens. Once your name is spoken in the tavern, you belong to the whisper now. The accusation did not need proof. That is the hardest part. Tonight we are not here to frighten you. We are here to witness. We will walk past the ducking ponds, the courtrooms, and the gallows, but we will not linger on the suffering. We will look at the machinery of belief. We will see the real women and men caught inside it. Breathe in the cool night air of 1645. Let the slow drip of the water ground you. From today's view, it is a tragedy of mass paranoia. From their view, it was a necessary cleansing of an invisible war. And that's what's so chilling.
Chelmsford, Essex, July 1445. An English nobleman named Robert Rich, the Earl of Warwick, sits at the head of a heavy oak table in a crowded, stiflingly hot courtroom. He is not a fanatic. He is a seasoned military commander, a respected parliamentarian, and a man of the state appointed to oversee the county assizes. Before him sits a clerk dipping a sharpened goose quill into a heavy pot of iron gall ink. The clerk begins to record the testimonies against 29 women from the surrounding villages. Listen to what the record shows. Not screams, not pitchforks, not a village driven mad by moonlight. The record shows depositions, sworn statements, careful, itemized lists of sick cattle, spoiled milk, and sudden fevers. The clerk writes in a neat, sweeping, administrative hand. And the worst part isn't the number of women waiting in the holding cells, or the suffocating heat of the summer courtroom, or the wooden gallows being built outside. The worst part is how terribly ordinary it all feels. There was no screaming mob. There was a table, a Bible, a jury of local men, and a clerk with good handwriting. That is the hardest thing to look at. We are conditioned by folklore and film to imagine the witch trials as a frenzy of collective madness. We picture flaming torches held by masked inquisitors. We picture a chaotic rush to a burning stake fueled by hysteria and bloodlust. But the truth of the early modern English witch trial is so much quieter and so much worse. The machinery that condemned a person to death was not broken. It was not a riot that overpowered the local authorities. It was the authorities. The courts were working exactly as they were designed to work. The courtroom at Chelmsford smelled of unwashed wool. It smelled of stale ale from the tavern across the square. It smelled of tallow candles, of damp earth, of old wood. Outside, in the July heat, perhaps there was a sudden summer rain, leaving behind the slow, patient drip of water from a cracked wooden gutter. Drip, drip, drip. Inside, the dominant sound was the scratch of the pen and the shuffling of boots on the floorboards and the low, measured voice of a magistrate reading a charge. And there was no burning. That is the first great myth we must leave behind in the dark. On the European continent, under different legal systems, witchcraft was often prosecuted as a heresy, a crime against God, punished by fire. But in England, the law saw things differently. Under the Witchcraft Acts, the crime was a felony. It was an act of harm. It was tried like murder. It was tried like theft. The punishment, written plainly in the statutes, was the rope. The accused were not dragged to a pyre in the dead of night. They were walked to the gallows in the daylight, under the supervision of a sheriff, just like any other common criminal. It was a civic procedure, paid for by the town, accounted for in the municipal ledgers. A few pence for the jailer's keep, a few shillings for the executioner's time, a tidy, balanced ledger of death. Let us walk through the steps of this quiet machine. It is a process so bureaucratic it borders on the mundane. It did not begin with the Grand Inquisitor kicking down a door. It began, almost always, with an accusation. A child blighted by a sudden fever, a calf born dead, a sharp, lingering pain in a neighbor's side. And beneath it all, a memory. A neighbor remembers a harsh word spoken over a fence 3 weeks prior. They remember an old woman asking for milk, being turned away and muttering under her breath as she walked down the lane. Once that seed was planted, the machinery turned. The local justice of the peace would be summoned. He was not a priest. He was a gentleman, a landowner, a man who understood property and law. He would sit in his own parlor, or perhaps in the back room of a village inn, and he would take depositions. The neighbors would come in one by one. They would place their hands on a Bible. They would swear an oath to the king or to Parliament, and they would tell their stories. The clerk would write it all down. The pain in the side, the strange shape of a dog seen in the twilight, the muttered curse. The accusation did not need proof. That is the hardest part. The legal threshold was not hard physical evidence as we understand it today. The threshold was sworn testimony. If 3 neighbors swore before a magistrate that they believed a woman had bewitched a horse, that belief became a legal fact. It was entered into the record. It became evidence.
After the depositions came the examination of the accused. The woman would be brought before the justice. She would be questioned. Her answers, her denials, her tears, or her silence, everything was recorded by the scratching pen. If the justice of the peace found that the complaints had merit, he would draft a document called a mithimus. It was a standard legal warrant. It ordered the constable to take the accused to the county jail, there to await the next session of the assize courts. The assizes were the great rhythmic heartbeat of English law. Twice a year, in the spring and in the summer, senior judges from London would ride the circuit. They traveled from county town to county town, bringing the central authority of the state into the muddy shires. They brought trumpets and javelin men and pageantry. They brought order. When the judges arrived in a town like Chelmsford, the jails were emptied into the courtrooms. The process that followed was meticulously fair by the standards of the 17th century. Bills of indictment were drawn up in formal Latin. A grand jury of local gentlemen would review the bills to ensure there was a case to answer. If they agreed, they endorsed the bill with the words "billa vera," a true bill. Then came the trial itself. The accused stood before a petty jury, 12 ordinary men, yeomen, farmers, blacksmiths, carpenters, men who knew the price of grain and the toll of a hard winter. They were not theologians debating the finer points of demonology. They were local men, tasked with deciding a matter of fact. Did this woman cause the death of that pig? Did she cause the wasting sickness of that child?
The witnesses were called. The depositions were read aloud in English, translating the Latin charges into the language of the village lane. The accused was allowed to speak, though she had no defense lawyer to speak for her. There was no cross-examination. There was only the weight of the community's fear formalized into legal procedure, pressing down on her shoulders. To understand how this could happen, to look clearly at the Earl of Warwick and his clerk, you have to let go of the modern mind. You have to understand that they believed it. They sincerely, genuinely believed every word of it. They were not cynical men using the law to commit murder. They believed that the devil was a physical, active presence in the world. They believed he was walking the earth, making pacts with vulnerable souls, recruiting human agents to overthrow God's kingdom and ruin the harvest. To the early modern mind, a witch was not a harmless eccentric. She was a domestic terrorist, armed with supernatural weapons, living right next door. Failing to root them out endangered the entire parish. It risked the wrath of God. The magistrates, the jurors, the clerks, they did not see themselves as monsters. They saw themselves as protectors. They were doing their civic duty. They were saving their community from a very real, very present danger. The horror is not that they lost their minds. The horror is that they were acting rationally within a worldview that was fundamentally terrified. And that is why, once the accusation was made, the trap was absolute. You could not reason with a system that believed it was doing the necessary administrative work of survival. The court was a patient, orderly machine. It did not hate you, it merely processed you. Once your name was entered into the deposition book, once the clerk sanded the wet ink and blew away the dust, the village you had known your whole life transformed. The familiar faces in the market square became the faces of the sworn jury. The men who bought your husband's grain became the men who measured the rope. You belong to the whisper now. The parchment was thick, heavy with the black ink of the state. The point was simple. The crown required a record. The trial needed a shape. The process
sealed the fate. The bureaucracy of death moved slowly, calmly, and without passion. It was a tragedy of perfectly kept records. From today's view, this looks like madness disguised as justice. From their view, it was the meticulous defense of a fragile world. And that's what's so chilling.
Manningtree, Essex. The year is 1647. A young man named Matthew Hopkins, barely 27 years old and already coughing with the consumption that will soon kill him, takes up a pen in a quiet room and writes a pamphlet that will outlive him by nearly 4 centuries. Listen to what he wrote to the public that was beginning to turn against him. Quote, "Certain queries answered, which have been and are likely to be objected against Matthew Hopkins in his way of finding out witches." He wrote it to defend his own name. He wrote it because the magistrates were growing tired of his fees, and the towns were starting to ask if his cures were worse than the curses. He published it as a short, tidy book, structured as a perfectly reasonable legal argument. And the worst part isn't the arrogance of the pamphlet, or the money he made from the terror, or the 100 souls he had sent to the gallows in just over 14 months. The worst part is the calm, rational, almost polite tone he uses to describe the machinery of death. He wrote not as a fanatic, but as an injured public servant. He wrote to explain that he was simply doing a necessary job and doing it well. That is what makes it so hard to look at. To understand the great witch hunts of early modern England, you must look closely at Matthew Hopkins. He is the center of the dark wheel. And the first thing you must understand is that he was nobody. He was not a judge of the assizes. He was not an ordained priest of the church. He was not a lord or a magistrate or a knight. He was the son of a Puritan minister from Suffolk, a man who had perhaps trained briefly as a lawyer's clerk before settling in the small, damp river town of Manningtree. He had a little money, a solemn manner, and a keen sense of the shifting winds. He was young. That is a detail that often slips through the cracks of the folklore. We picture the witch-finder as a grizzled, ancient inquisitor, heavy with decades of theological study. But Hopkins was in his mid-20s when the campaign began in 1645. He was a young man of the middling sort, navigating a country that was violently tearing itself apart in the English Civil War. The normal authorities were distracted. The assize judges were not riding their usual circuits with the same regularity. The world felt broken, apocalyptic, and deeply unsafe. Into that void stepped Matthew Hopkins, carrying a self-appointed title that held no actual legal weight, Witch-Finder General. He did not work alone. He rode with a slightly older partner, a man named John Stern, who would later write his own defensive account, A Confirmation and Discovery of Witchcraft. Together, they built a business model out of fear. They did not usually force their way into a village. They were invited. They were hired.
Imagine the arrival. The slow drip of water from the stone bridge at the edge of town. Drip, drip, drip. You would hear the hooves before you saw the horses. A small company of men riding into the parish, their cloaks heavy with road dust and summer rain. The town would have already taken up a collection to pay for their services. They came because the village was frightened. A cow had died of a strange bloat. A child had suffered a fit. The local cunning woman had muttered a threat. The fear was already there, pooling in the taverns and the marketplaces, waiting for a structure. Hopkins simply provided the structure. He brought the appearance of the law. He brought an organized, methodical system of investigation. And because the people of East Anglia genuinely believed in the physical reality of the devil, they welcomed him as a specialist. He was an expert, called in to diagnose an invisible plague. The speed and scale of what followed is staggering. Before Hopkins, a witch trial was a rare, localized event. Over the preceding century, the executions were sparse. But in the roughly 14 months of his active campaign across Essex, Suffolk, Norfolk, and beyond, Hopkins and Stern oversaw the executions of an estimated 100 to 300 people. We use conservative numbers because the records are fragmented, but even the lowest estimate is a staggering spike in the quiet history of the English counties. It was an industrialization of suspicion. Once they arrived, the whisper that had been circulating in the village was given a formal, deadly weight. The local magistrates would authorize the detention of suspects. Hopkins and his searchers would begin their work. If you were a marginalized woman, an old widow, a scolding neighbor, you knew what the arrival of the horses meant. Once your name was given to the witch-finder, you belonged to the whisper now. The accusation did not need proof. That is the hardest part. Suspicion was the currency, and Hopkins knew exactly how to mint it into confessions. But by 1647, the tide was turning. The sheer number of the dead, the disruption to the towns, and the mounting financial cost of his services began to awaken the authorities from their stupor. Clergymen began to preach against him. Judges began to question his methods. They asked by what authority he operated, and they asked how a man could find so many witches unless he was perhaps using dark arts himself. And so he sat down to write. The book he produced, The Discovery of Witches, is a remarkable surviving object. It is a physical artifact of terror. You can still see copies of it today, preserved in the hushed, climate-controlled rooms of the British Library and other archives. The pages are rough, made of early modern rag paper. The ink is fading to a soft brown. The typography is uneven, stamped by a heavy iron press, but the voice is perfectly clear. He wrote the pamphlet as a series of 14 queries, 14 questions his critics were asking, and 14 calm, lawyerly answers. Listen to query 14. His critics had accused him of doing it all for the money, of bleeding the poor parishes dry. Hopkins's response is a masterpiece of bureaucratic grievance. He demands but 20 shillings a town, Hopkins wrote of himself, speaking in the third person, and doth sometimes ride 20 miles for that, and hath no more for all his charges thither and back again, and it may be stays a week there, and find there 3 or 4 witches.
He sounds genuinely offended. 20 shillings, he argues, barely covers his travel expenses. It barely covers the cost of maintaining his company. He is offering a bargain, a public service, rooting out the agents of Satan for a mere 20 shillings a town. And this is the thanks he receives? The chilling effect is not in a description of violence. The chilling effect is in the ledger. He is discussing the uncovering of human beings destined for the gallows, as if he were discussing a difficult contract for repairing a local bridge. The pamphlet does not read like the diary of a madman. It reads like the memoirs of a misunderstood regional manager. He details his methods with the dry precision of a surveyor. He explains why he does what he does, leaning on the theology of the day, leaning on the genuine terror of the populace, presenting himself as a rational actor in an irrational world. The book was a shield, forged from ink and paper, meant to protect him from the growing scrutiny of the state. But he would not live to see whether the shield held. The story of Matthew Hopkins has a sudden, quiet end, heavily obscured by folklore. For centuries, a legend persisted that Hopkins was eventually overthrown by his own methods.
The story goes that an angry mob finally turned on the witch-finder general, accused him of witchcraft, and forced him to undergo the swimming test, bound and thrown into a river. The legend claims he floated, proving his guilt, and was hanged on his own gallows. It is a satisfying, symmetrical story. It offers a kind of cosmic justice that human history rarely provides. But it is only a story. It is a myth, popularized years later in satirical poetry and local rumors. The truth of his end is much quieter and much more ordinary. By the summer of 1647, just as his defensive pamphlet was circulating, Hopkins had retired back to Manningtree. He was ill. He had likely contracted pleural tuberculosis, a common and wasting disease known then as consumption. His lungs were failing. The man who had terrified 4 counties, who had sent dozens of women to suffocate at the end of a hemp rope, died quietly in his own bed in August of 1647. He was buried in the churchyard at Mistley Heath. He was gone before he was 30. The campaign dissolved with his death and the gradual return of normal legal oversight after the worst of the Civil War. But the damage was done. The graves were filled, and the pamphlet remained. The surviving copies of The Discovery of Witches sit quietly on library shelves today. They do not scream. They do not smell of fear. They smell only of old dust and binding glue. They are small, fragile things, easily held in one hand. But inside those pages is the meticulous, rational defense of the indefensible. From today's view, this looks like the cynical profiteering of a con artist. From their view, it was the authorized manual of a holy war. And that's what's so chilling.
Edinburgh, 1597. A king sits at a heavy wooden desk by the light of a tallow candle. He is James VI of Scotland, a man who will, in just a few short years, inherit the English throne and become James I of England. He takes up a quill and writes the preface to a short philosophical dialogue he has titled Daemonology. Listen to what he wrote, addressing his subjects directly. The fearful abounding at this time in this country of these detestable slaves of the devil, the witches or enchanters, hath moved me, beloved reader, to dispatch in post this following treatise of mine. He wrote it to convince the skeptics. He wrote it to prove that the agents of Satan were real, that they were organized, and that they must be hunted without mercy. And the worst part isn't the paranoia of the text, or the royal authority behind it, or the lives it would eventually extinguish. The worst part is the other legacy of the man holding the pen. This is the same king who would soon commission the King James Bible. The same reign, the same court, the same scholarly certainty. The man who gave the English language its most enduring scripture also wrote the manual for hunting witches, and the law he signed into effect would still be hanging women 40 years later, long after he was dead. We often imagine that the witch trials were a product of peasant superstition, a local terror that the educated elite simply failed to stop. But the truth is exactly the reverse. The terror was codified at the very top. It was debated in Parliament. It was drafted by scholars. It was signed by monarchs. It was a statutory crime, printed in heavy bound books, distributed to magistrates across the country. Before James, there was the Witchcraft Act of 1563, passed under Queen Elizabeth I. Elizabeth's law was harsh, but it retained a shred of secular proportion. Under the 1563 Act, witchcraft was a capital crime only if it caused the death of a human being.
If a witch was convicted of destroying property or sickening a cow, the punishment for a first offense was a year in prison and a regular turn in the local pillory. It was treated as a dangerous nuisance, a crime of malicious damage. But when James took the throne, he brought his terror with him. In 1604, a new Witchcraft Act was passed. This statute was sharper, wider, and far more lethal. The 1604 Act made it a felony, punishable by death on the very first offense, simply to consult, covenant with, entertain, employ, feed, or reward any evil or wicked spirit. The crime was no longer just the harm caused. The crime was the association. A woman did not need to kill a neighbor to be hanged. She merely needed to be suspected of making a pact with the dark. The state had legislated an invisible crime. But a court of law still required evidence. The assize judges were educated men. They could not simply execute a woman because a farmer had a bad dream. They needed proof that satisfied the legal parameters of the statute. And so, the legal system developed accepted categories of evidence, a bizarre, chilling taxonomy of the impossible, treated with the same bureaucratic gravity as a forged deed or a stolen horse.
The first category of evidence was the devil's mark. The theology of the time dictated that when a person made a pact with the devil, he sealed the bargain by touching them, leaving a physical blemish on the skin. This mark was said to be insensible to pain and would not bleed if pricked. And so the search became a standard, state-sanctioned procedure. The accused would be stripped. In the case of women, they were searched by panels of local, respectable matrons, sometimes midwives, sometimes the wives of the magistrates themselves. They looked for moles, skin tags, birthmarks, scars. The body was mapped. The body was scrutinized. If a suspicious mark was found, it was tested with a specialized pin. The searchers would press the metal into the skin. If the woman did not cry out, perhaps out of shock, perhaps because the pin struck dead tissue, or perhaps because the searcher used a trick pin that retracted into its handle, the lack of blood was recorded by the clerk. It was not a chaotic assault. It was an inspection, logged as physical evidence of a supernatural felony. The second category was the witch's teat. This was distinct from the devil's mark. Under the 1604 Act, it was a capital offense to feed or reward an evil spirit. The courts believed that witches kept demonic servants, called familiars, which appeared in the shape of ordinary animals. These familiars were said to feed on the witch's own blood, suckling from a hidden teat on her body. A wart, a hemorrhoid, an unusual fold of skin, any of these could be sworn into the court record as a witch's teat. This brings us to the familiar itself, the third category of evidence. In the damp agricultural communities of early modern England, animals were everywhere. Barn cats hunted mice in the grain stores. Dogs slept by the hearth. Toads lived in the muddy lanes. To the courts, these were not just animals, they were potential weapons. If an old woman was seen talking to her cat, or if a dog ran across the path of a man right before he suffered a stroke, the animal was transformed into a legal instrument of malice. During the trials of Matthew Hopkins, watchers would keep the accused awake in a sealed room, waiting for a familiar to appear. If a spider crawled across the floorboards or a fly buzzed against the window pane, the watchers would swear an oath that an imp had come to the witch. The ordinary natural world was weaponized in the courtroom. The fourth and most dangerous category was spectral evidence. This was the testimony of victims who claimed to see the spirit or the shape of the witch attacking them, even if the accused's physical body was miles away in a locked cell.
Imagine the chilling weight of this in a court of law. A sick child lies in a bed, thrashing in a fever. The child cries out that the woman from the end of the lane is standing at the foot of the bed, pinching them. The parents swear to it. The magistrate writes it down. The accused woman can bring 10 witnesses to swear she was in her own kitchen at the time, but the court will simply nod. The physical body was in the kitchen, yes, but the specter was in the bedroom.
How do you defend yourself against a crime that happens in someone else's mind? How do you prove your innocence when the laws of physics have been suspended by an act of Parliament? There was no defense. The structure of the trial ensured that denial itself would be read as guilt. If an accused woman wept and confessed, she was hanged. If she stood tall, denied the charges, and refused to break, the court reasoned that the devil had hardened her heart to protect her. Silence was guilt. Anger was guilt. Despair was guilt. The accusation did not need proof. That is the hardest part. The legal threshold was not truth. The legal threshold was process. The 1604 Act provided the parameters. The magistrates provided the structure. The local juries, terrified for their own souls and their own children, provided the verdicts. It was a perfect, closed loop of logic. Once you were inside the machinery, the gears simply turned until they crushed you. When you read the transcripts of these trials, you do not hear the ravings of madmen. You hear the slow, rhythmic language of the English common law. You hear the slow drip of water outside the courtroom window. Drip, drip, drip. You hear the clerk asking the foreman of the jury for the verdict. You hear the foreman say the word, guilty. You hear the judge reach for the black cap, not in anger, but with the heavy, solemn duty of a state official carrying out the written will of his king. The tragedy of the 1604 Witchcraft Act is that it gave permission to the darkest impulses of the human heart, and it dressed them up in the respectable clothes of civic duty. It allowed a neighbor to destroy a neighbor, not with a knife in the dark, but with a sworn oath in the daylight. Once the state gave the village the vocabulary of the crime, the village could not stop speaking it. Once the king signed the paper, you belong to the whisper now. The statute book was thick, the parchment was heavy, the Latin was flawless. The men who wrote the law were some of the most educated, literate, and devout men of their century. They built a system that operated flawlessly on a foundation of absolute vapor. From today's view, this looks like a paranoid fiction written into law. From their view, it was the necessary legal framework to protect the kingdom from an invisible army. And that's what's so chilling. Manningtree, Essex, March 1445. An elderly widow named Elizabeth Clark sits on a wooden stool in a cramped, drafty room. She is exhausted. She is shivering. She is entirely alone, surrounded by men who will not let her close her eyes. She is poor. She relies on the parish for her survival, and she has only one leg. A clerk dips a goose quill pen into a pot of ink and records the words they have finally broken out of her. Listen to what the record shows. Elizabeth Clark, widow, being examined, confesseth, and saith that about 6 months since she met with the devil in the likeness of a proper gentleman, with a laced band, having the whole proportion of a man, and would have had her consent to lie with him. She said this after being kept awake for several consecutive days and nights, closely guarded by Matthew Hopkins and his searchers. And the worst part isn't the absurdity of the confession, or the smallness of the room, or the missing leg.
The worst part is how perfectly she fits the profile of the condemned. Before we can understand the machinery, we have to look at the people it consumed. We have to turn the camera around, away from the judges and the witch-finders, and stand quietly beside the accused. When you hear the word witch, centuries of folklore supply an image: a powerful enchantress, a sinister figure muttering curses over a boiling cauldron. But the reality of the early modern witch trials was entirely mundane and deeply tragic. The people who were pulled into the courts were, overwhelmingly, the most defenseless souls in the parish. They were people who had fallen through the cracks of the world. Elizabeth Clark was the first person Matthew Hopkins formally investigated. Her arrest lit the fire that would burn across East Anglia. And she was everything a witch was imagined to be, precisely because she was everything society had discarded. She was a woman. She was old. She was widowed, meaning she had no husband, no father, and no brother to stand between her and the magistrates. And she was disabled. She lived on the absolute margins of the village economy. In the 17th century, there was no social safety net beyond the Tudor Poor Laws. A parish was legally required to support its destitute through a local tax. For an aging, disabled widow, life was a constant, humiliating cycle of begging for scraps: a handful of flour, a cup of small beer, a piece of firewood to get through the January frost. This poverty is the secret engine of the witch trials. In the shifting world of early modern England, the old communal bonds were fraying. The rising middling class, the yeoman farmers and the merchants, began to resent the burden of the poor. When an old woman like Elizabeth Clark knocked on a door asking for milk, the neighbor would often turn her away. But turning away an old, starving woman produced a profound, lingering guilt. As she limped away down the dirt lane, perhaps she muttered under her breath, a complaint, a prayer, a curse. The neighbor watched her go, feeling the sting of a violated Christian duty. And then, 3 days later, that neighbor's best milking cow suddenly sickened and died.
The human mind cannot easily tolerate both guilt and random tragedy. It seeks a narrative. The neighbor did not want to believe they were cruel for denying a starving woman, and they did not want to believe the world was random enough to kill a healthy cow for no reason. The solution was terrifying, but it was neat. The old woman was not a victim of poverty. She was a servant of Satan. She had cursed the cow in revenge. The guilt was instantly transmuted into righteous victimhood. Once that narrative took hold, the machinery engaged. And the machinery did not require proof of the curse. It only required a confession. Because the English legal system officially forbade physical torture, there were no racks, no thumbscrews, no iron maidens in the local county jails. The witch-finders had to use a different method. They used a legal loophole. The law did not forbid observation. It did not forbid watching. To find a witch's familiar, the courts believed, one merely had to watch the witch until the creature appeared to feed. And so Elizabeth Clark was placed in a room. She was stripped and searched, and then she was watched. Imagine the reality of that room. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, of damp wool, of burning tallow candles. The men work in shifts. They sit in the corners of the room, talking softly, their eyes fixed on the old woman on the stool. Outside, the early spring rain falls on the thatched roof. There is the slow, steady drip of water from the window frame. Drip, drip, drip.
a patient, relentless metronome marking the hours of her torment. When her head nods, when her chin falls to her chest, they shout, they bang on the floorboards. If she continues to drift into sleep, they pull her up, they force her to walk the length of the room. For an elderly woman with one leg, forced to move back and forth on a makeshift crutch or supported roughly by the arms of her captors, the physical agony would have been immediate and overwhelming. She is kept awake for a day, then 2 days, then 3 days. If you have ever been truly, profoundly sleep-deprived, you know how quickly the mind begins to fracture. The edges of the room blur, the shadows stretch into shapes, the rational mind collapses, leaving only a desperate animal need for the torment to stop. You sit in the dark, and you hear your own name before you understand what it means. Your body is a heavy, aching stone. But even here, in the cold heart of the cruelty, the record sometimes shows a flicker of humanity. This is the first small mercy we find in the dark. It is recorded in similar trials that occasionally a local watcher, a neighbor drafted into the shift, someone who had known the accused their whole life, would quietly step forward when the magistrate was out of the room. They would offer a sip of water. They would drape a woolen blanket over the shivering shoulders of the accused. A small, silent rebellion of human decency inside a system built on fear. But the machinery always resumed. After 3 or 4 days without sleep, Elizabeth Clark's mind finally broke.
She began to give them exactly what they wanted. The men with the pens asked her leading questions, and her shattered mind supplied the answers. She confessed to sleeping with the devil. She confessed to harboring familiars. She looked into the dark corners of the room, and she named them. The deposition lists the names she spoke. Holt, a creature like a white kitten. Jarmara, a fat spaniel without legs. Vinegar Tom, a long-legged greyhound. Sack and Sugar, a black rabbit. News, a polecat. To the men recording this, it was a triumph. It was irrefutable sworn evidence of the supernatural. But to a modern ear, reading the deposition in the quiet of an archive, it is something else entirely. It is the devastating poetry of a fractured brain. It is an old, exhausted woman pulling the names of household pets out of her delirium, saying whatever she must say to make the men let her sleep. The tragedy of the witch trials is that a broken mind produced the evidence used to hang it. The confession was signed. The guilt was sealed. But the interrogators were not satisfied with animals. They needed a conspiracy. They asked her who else was with her, who else in the village danced in the dark, who else had signed the devil's book. And so, weeping, delirious, and entirely broken, Elizabeth Clark named names. She named another local woman, Ann West. She named others. The fire caught. The hysteria slipped its leash and ran into the neighboring towns. Because once a name was spoken in that room, the process took over. A woman waking up in her own bed 3 miles away, entirely unaware of what had happened in the night, was suddenly a condemned woman. The constable would be at her door by noon. You belong to the whisper now. The courts did not look for corroborating physical evidence. They did not investigate alibis. They had a sworn confession taken from the mouth of a confirmed witch naming her accomplices. The legal standard had been met. The accusation did not need proof. That is the hardest part. Elizabeth Clark was tried at the Chelmsford Assizes in July of 1645. Her confession, extracted through the slow, agonizing destruction of her sanity, was read aloud to the jury. She was found guilty. She was taken out to the gallows, a disabled woman in her 80th year, and she was hanged by the neck until she was dead. There was no grand supernatural battle. There was only a rope, a cart, and the quiet, bureaucratic end to a difficult, impoverished life. She was not a monster. She was not a saint. She was simply a person who had outlived her usefulness to her community, and who was sacrificed to cure their fear. From today's view, this looks like the agonizing, systematic abuse of a vulnerable elder. From their view, they had successfully disarmed a general in Satan's army and saved their own children from the dark. And that's what's so chilling.
Edinburgh, 1597. The King's Book, Daemonology, sits open on a reading stand. In the third book, in the 6th chapter, James I outlines a theory that will soon travel south into the English shires and drag hundreds of people into the cold village ponds. He is answering a question. How can a magistrate physically prove a crime that is committed in secret, using invisible forces? Listen to what the king wrote about the water test. It appears that God hath appointed that the water shall refuse to receive them in her bosom, that have shaken off them the sacred water of baptism, and wilfully refused the benefit thereof. He wrote this not as poetry, but as jurisprudence. The logic was perfectly circular and perfectly deadly. Because the witch had rejected the holy water of the church, the natural element of water would supernaturally reject the witch. And the worst part isn't the twisting of theology, or the public spectacle, or the cheering of the crowd on the banks. The worst part is the impossible bind at the center of the ordeal. There was only one way to pass the test. To be found innocent, you had to sink. Think for a moment about what that meant for the innocent. Tonight, we are going to walk through the methods used to prove the crime of witchcraft. We will not look at them as a spectacle of suffering. We will look at them the way a curator looks at an exhibit behind glass long after the museum has closed. We will examine the tools, the logic, and the careful, meticulous procedure of the tests. Because the horror of these trials is not found in chaos, it is found in the pseudo-scientific certainty of the men conducting them. Let us begin at the edge of the water. The swimming test, or the ducking, was the most public of the ordeals. It was usually conducted at the local mill pond or a slow-moving stretch of the village river. The whole parish would gather. The mood was not a riot, it was an investigation. The magistrate or the witch-finder stood on the bank, directing the men with the ropes. The accused was prepared according to a very specific traditional formula. They were stripped to their undergarments. They were bound in a position known as cross-bound. The right thumb was tied tightly to the left big toe. The left thumb was tied to the right big toe. The body was pulled into an unnatural, arched shape, incapable of swimming, incapable of treading water. A heavy hemp rope was then tied around the waist. The ends of this rope were held by men on opposite sides of the pond, theoretically to pull the accused back to land before they could drown. Imagine the sensory weight of that moment, the cold of the autumn air on bare skin, the rough bite of the hemp, the hush of the watching crowd, the dark, opaque surface of the English pond, and beneath it all, the slow drip of water from the wet ropes trailing onto the muddy bank. Drip, drip, drip. A patient, quiet counting of the seconds. The accused was lifted and tossed into the water. If they floated, if their clothing trapped air, if the strange arched position of their body kept them buoyant, the water was said to be rejecting them. They were pulled out.
guilty. If they sank like a stone, the water was accepting them. They were innocent.
The paradox is stark. The methods looked like investigation. They functioned as confirmation. To survive the test was to fail it. To pass the test was to risk drowning. It is true that the men holding the ropes usually pulled the innocent back to the surface, but not always quickly enough. The cruelty was woven directly into the logic of the element itself. Once the crowd saw you float, the trial was essentially over in their minds. You belonged to the whisper now. But the water was only one test. The courts preferred evidence written on the body. Under the theology of the day, a pact with the devil was a physical contract, and it left a physical seal. This was the devil's mark. The belief held that when Satan touched his new servant, the spot was forever altered. It became insensible to pain, and it would not bleed. Finding this mark was considered absolute empirical proof of guilt. And so a new profession emerged, the pricker. These were men who traveled from town to town, charging a fee to examine the accused. They carried a specialized tool called a bodkin. It looked like a long, thick needle or an awl, often set into a wooden or brass handle. The accused would be stripped, shaved of all body hair, and presented to the pricker. He would systematically press the needle into their flesh, searching for the spot that yielded no blood and provoked no cry. Look closely at the bodkin. It is the most chilling artifact in our dark museum. It represents the exact intersection of superstition and fraud. While some prickers were sincere fanatics using ordinary needles, historical records confirm that others were simply con artists. They carried trick bodkins. These tools were hollowed out. The blade was set on a hidden spring inside the handle, exactly like a modern stage dagger. When the pricker pressed the point against the skin of the accused, the needle did not pierce the flesh. It simply retracted smoothly into the brass casing. To the magistrate watching from a few feet away, it looked like a miracle. The needle appeared to sink 3 inches into a woman's thigh. She did not bleed. She did not scream. The pricker would step back, hold up the tool, and declare the mark found. He collected his fee. The woman went to the gallows. The illusion of guilt was sold for a few shillings, and the court recorded it as scientific fact. If a mark was not found by the pricker, the search turned to the witch's teat. This was the blemish where the demonic familiar was said to feed. Because of the intimate nature of this test, the courts maintained a strict, chilling propriety. The male magistrates did not conduct this test. They appointed panels of local women, usually matrons of good standing or midwives, to take the accused into a private room. The indignity of this process was total, but it was conducted with the quiet order of a medical examination. The accused was stripped entirely. Her body was subjected to a humiliating inch-by-inch inventory. In the damp, unsanitary conditions of the 17th century, almost everyone had some physical imperfection: a skin tag, a large mole, a hemorrhoid, a scar from a childhood burn. The matrons were looking for the supernatural, and so they found it in the utterly mundane. A natural blemish was recorded by the clerk as a demonic appendage. The body itself was weaponized against the person living inside it.
The accusation did not need proof. That is the hardest part. The physical evidence was whatever the court decided it was. If you floated, you were guilty. If you had a mole, you were guilty. If the stage prop needle retracted, you were guilty. And if none of these physical tests yielded a result, the court could simply return to the method of exhaustion.
We have already seen the watching, the accused placed on a stool in the center of a room, the forced walking, the days and nights without sleep, the watchers waiting for a spider or a mouse to run across the floorboards so they could point to it and call it an imp. The watching was the final fail-safe test. If the body did not condemn the witch, the mind eventually would. The sleep deprivation would fracture the accused's sanity until they provided the confession the court required. Every test shared the same underlying architecture. They were structured as inquiries, but they were designed as traps. A genuine investigation seeks to find the truth, even if the truth is innocence. But the tests of the witch-finder were built on the assumption that the person before them was already an agent of the devil. The ordeal was simply the formal ceremony of proving what the town already knew. There was no path to vindication that did not require a miracle. You could not reason with a retracting blade. You could not argue with the buoyancy of water. You could not explain away the natural geography of your own skin. The law had codified the impossible, and the tests were the instruments used to measure it. When we look back at these tools, the rope, the bodkin, the stool in the center of the watched room, we do not see the weapons of a chaotic mob. We see the instruments of a society desperately trying to impose order on its own terror. They needed the tests to work. They needed the accused to fail. Because if the tests were false, if the old woman floating in the mill pond was just an old woman, then the community had to face the unthinkable truth. There was no invisible war. There were only neighbors, legally murdering neighbors. From today's view, this looks like a sadistic theater of the absurd. From their view, it was a rigorous, scientifically sound defense of the human soul. And that's what's so chilling.
St. Osyth, Essex, 1582. A village woman named Ursula Kemp, known to everyone in the parish as a healer and a midwife, stands before a local magistrate named Brian Darcy. Listen to what the court record says about her. She was brought into the courtroom not because she was an outcast, but because she was a staple of the community. She knew how to ease the aching joints of the elderly. She knew the charms to break a sudden childhood fever. She had, according to the records, successfully treated the illnesses of her neighbors for years. And the worst part isn't that she was arrested, or that she was forced to confess, or that she was hanged. The worst part is the reason the constables finally came for her. The village came to her door when a child would not stop coughing, and the village came to her door later with a rope. To understand the deepest tragedy of the witch trials, we have to look past the courtrooms and the pamphlets and step inside the village cottages. We are going to dismantle the most pervasive myth of the era, the idea that the accused were universally despised outcasts lurking on the edges of society, doing nothing but harm. The truth is far more complicated and far more sorrowful. Close your eyes and picture a small timber-framed house at the end of a muddy lane. Inside, it smells of wood smoke, of drying earth, of bundled herbs hanging from the low rafters. Yarrow, feverfew, St. John's wort, chamomile. Outside, the rain has stopped, but the damp remains, marked by the slow, rhythmic drip of water from the thatch. Drip. Drip, drip. In the early modern world, there was no public health care. If you were a wealthy merchant in London, you could hire a university-trained physician who would balance your humors and bleed you with leeches.
But if you were a farmer in Essex or a laborer in Suffolk, a physician was miles away and cost more gold than you would see in a decade. Instead, the rural working poor relied on the cunning folk. They relied on the wise women. These were the local practitioners of folk medicine. They were ordinary women, often older, often widowed, who possessed generations of inherited knowledge about roots, poultices, and midwifery. They delivered the babies. They laid out the dead. They brewed tonics for sick cattle, and they prescribed simple rhythmic charms to soothe a crying infant. They were the absolute center of village survival. But the early modern mind operated on a terrifying symmetry. The logic was flawless, and it was deadly. If a woman possessed the secret knowledge to draw a sickness out of a human body, they reasoned, she must possess the exact same knowledge to put a sickness in. The boundary between healing and harming was paper thin. A wise woman was respected, yes, but she was also deeply feared. Her power was a dual-edged sword. When a family hired a cunning woman to cure a lame horse, and the horse recovered, they paid her a penny and gave thanks. But what happened when the medicine failed? Infant mortality in the 17th century was staggeringly high. Crops failed with the frost. Sickness swept through the damp, crowded cottages with merciless speed. When a mother lost a child, the grief was absolute, and the grief demanded a target. It was unbearable to believe that God had simply let the baby die, or that the world was cruel and random. It was much easier to believe that the herb woman had mixed a curse into her chamomile.
This is what happened to Ursula Kemp. She was a healer who had successfully cured a neighbor, Grace Thurlow, of crippling arthritis. The two women were close, but they had a mundane, ordinary falling out over the nursing of Grace's newborn daughter. A few months later, the infant tragically fell from its crib and broke its neck. Grace Thurlow did not blame the crib. She did not blame the tragic, random fragility of a newborn's life. She blamed the woman who had cured her arthritis. She went to the magistrate, and she swore that Ursula Kemp had bewitched the child to death in revenge. The hands that had healed the mother were legally accused of murdering the daughter. The accusation needed no proof. That is the hardest part. The dead baby was the proof. The failed remedy was the proof. Gratitude is a fragile emotion, easily curdled by terror. Once a healer was accused, every cure she had ever performed was retroactively viewed as dark magic. The village rewrote its own history. The woman who had sat by their bedsides, holding cold cloths to their foreheads through the long, terrifying nights of the sweating sickness, was suddenly transformed into a monster. And once that transformation happened, you belong to the whisper now. The rumors would spread from the tavern to the market square, collecting old grievances. A cow that died 3 years ago, a batch of milk that soured in the summer heat, all of it laid at the feet of the woman who lived at the end of the lane. This brings us to the demographic heart of the tragedy. Why were the accused overwhelmingly women? Modern pop culture sometimes claims that the witch trials were a coordinated, deliberate war by male doctors to wipe out female midwives. But the historical record shows something much quieter and much more systemic. It was not a vast medical conspiracy. It was the tragic result of the roles women were forced to occupy in a patriarchal society. Women managed the vulnerable thresholds of the human life cycle. They were the ones in the birthing room. They were the ones who washed the bodies of the dead.
They were the nurses, the cooks, the preparers of food and medicine. Because they stood so close to the fragile boundaries of life and death, they were the first ones blamed when someone crossed over into the dark. Furthermore, the theology of the era was explicitly misogynistic. The demonological texts imported from the continent and absorbed by English magistrates argued that women were spiritually and physically weaker than men, and therefore more susceptible to the devil's temptations. A woman who was outspoken, a woman who argued with her neighbors, a woman who survived on her own without a husband or a father to manage her affairs. She was an anomaly in the social order. She was a disruption. And if she was poor, as so many older widows were, she had to rely on begging or bartering her folk magic to survive. When she knocked on a door asking for a cup of flour, the neighbor felt the sharp sting of Christian guilt for wanting to turn her away. When she offered a healing charm in exchange for firewood, the neighbor took it, but felt the lingering dread of dealing in the occult.
The person the village depended on in its most desperate hours was the person the village found easiest to blame when those hours went wrong. But even within this terrible paradox, we can find a tiny, heartbreaking seed of light. It is a small mercy buried in the depositions. Before the trials began, before the witch-finders arrived with their bodkins and their ropes, there were thousands of quiet, unrecorded nights where these women simply did their jobs. We must remember the healer sitting up in the dark, unpaid and exhausted, rocking a sick child to sleep. We must remember the midwife walking 3 miles in the freezing rain to help a terrified young mother through a difficult labor. These were acts of profound human kindness. They were acts of genuine civic love. The tragedy is not just that these women were executed. The tragedy is that their genuine acts of mercy were weaponized against them by the very people they had saved. The state took their knowledge of the natural world, labeled it a supernatural felony, and hanged them for it. When we look back at the wise women of early modern England, we are not looking at a secret cult of pagans. We are looking at the village health system consumed by the village fear. From today's view, this looks like the ultimate betrayal of the caregivers. From their view, it was the necessary purging of a poison disguised as a cure. And that's what's so chilling.
Aldborough, Suffolk, late in the year 1645. A town official, the chamberlain of the borough, sits at a heavy oak desk in the quiet of the evening. He opens the municipal account book, a thick ledger bound in calfskin, and begins to record the seasonal expenses. Listen to what the archive shows. The entries are written in a neat, sweeping hand, itemizing the costs incurred by the town during the recent summer assizes. Paid to Mr. Hopkins, the ledger reads, for his pains, £2. He dips his pen again. He writes down the costs for the wood. He writes down the costs for the searchers. And the worst part isn't the total sum, or the banality of the handwriting, or the human lives attached to the numbers. The worst part is the absolute ordinariness of the invoice. The devil was the charge, but the bill was made out in shillings, and somebody in the town had to sign it. We have reached the quietest part of our journey. The heat of the courtroom has faded. The hysteria of the search has passed. The crowds have gone back to their farms and their hearths. What is left behind is the paperwork. Tonight, we are going to look at the mundane, uncomfortable truth that sat beneath the theology and the terror. We are going to look at the money. Witch-finding was not simply a religious crusade. It was a trade. It was a service industry, complete with independent contractors, expense accounts, and itemized receipts.
Matthew Hopkins and John Stern did not ride through East Anglia on a volunteer basis. They were professionals, and their profession required capital. When a town invited the witch-finders, they were entering into a financial contract. The magistrates believed they were purchasing a spiritual cleansing, but they were actually purchasing a sprawling bureaucracy. The quiet terror of the witch trials is how quickly it transformed a matter of life and death into a matter of administration. The Chamberlain's ledger in Aldeburgh is a beautiful, terrible object. The paper is heavy, made from pulped rags, holding the black iron gall ink perfectly. The entries are arranged in orderly columns. The point was simple. Every service rendered to the town must be accounted for. The borough paid for the repair of the church roof. The borough paid for the maintenance of the roads. The borough paid for the execution of its neighbors. The town of Stowmarket, another parish in the region, recorded an expense of over £23 for their witch-finding campaign. In the mid-16th century, £23 was a staggering sum. It was enough to build a house. It was enough to feed a family for years. Where did the money go? It did not all go to Matthew Hopkins. This is the detail that reveals the true creeping nature of the machinery. The witch-finder was only the catalyst. The local microeconomy absorbed the rest. When the accused were gathered, they had to be kept somewhere. The town jails were small, so the overflow was often kept in local inns or the back rooms of the guild halls. The innkeeper charged the town for the use of his rooms. The prisoners had to be fed. The baker charged the town for the bread. The brewer charged the town for the small beer.
Then came the investigation. When Elizabeth Clark and the others were kept awake for days in the watching rooms, the men who watched them did not do it for free. They were paid a daily wage by the town. They drank ale and ate meat during their shifts, all of it added to the parish tab. When the accused women were searched for the devil's mark, the local matrons who conducted the humiliating bodily searches were paid for their time. A few pence for the jailer, a few shillings for the searchers, £1 for the witch-finder. Once the witch-finder arrived, the whole parish was pulled into the ledger. You belong to the whisper now, and the whisper was expensive. This brings us to the terrible, quiet logic of the incentive. Hopkins and Stern were paid for a service. In his defensive pamphlet, The Discovery of Witches, Hopkins indignantly claimed that he demanded but 20 shillings a town, a single pound. He argued that this sum barely covered the cost of his travel, the maintenance of his horses, and his lodging at the local inn. But even if we take his 20-shilling fee at face value, the business model required volume. If a man is paid per town, and his reputation as an expert depends entirely on his ability to uncover a hidden enemy, he has every incentive in the world to find that enemy. He cannot arrive, inspect the village, and declare that the sick cow simply died of natural causes. If he does that, he is no longer an expert. He is just a traveler asking for a bed. To justify his presence, the witch-finder had to find witches. And because the courts had already established that physical proof of a curse was impossible to obtain, the process relied entirely on confessions and the discovery of natural blemishes. The accusation did not need proof. That is the hardest part. Because no real proof was needed, the supply of witches was limited only by the town's ability to pay the fees. The business scaled infinitely. The searchers found the marks because they were paid to find the marks. The watchers extracted the confessions because their employment depended on keeping the accused awake until the mind broke. It was not a conspiracy of evil men rubbing their hands together in the dark.
It was the cold banality of a system where everyone was simply doing their paid job. Close your eyes and imagine the counting house, the heavy oak table, the smell of old dust, of beeswax candles, of cold stone. Outside, the town is asleep. Down the lane near the old bridge, there is the slow, quiet drip of water. Farther off tonight, softer, drip, drip, drip. Inside, there is only the clinking of silver shillings being counted out of a leather purse, the chamberlain stacking the coins, the careful recording of the date. Item: paid to Mary Phillips, the searcher, for her pains. Item: paid to John Bysack for watching the prisoners. Item: paid for the wood and the carpenter's time to build the gallows. Item: paid for the rope.
The paperwork is endless, and it is entirely devoid of emotion. The ledger does not record the weeping of the accused. It does not record the terror of the children left behind. It only records the shillings and the pence. But this heavy financial burden is also quietly what helped bring the madness to an end. The early modern English town was not infinitely wealthy. The Civil War had already disrupted trade. Harvests were unpredictable. As Hopkins and Sterne moved from county to county, leaving behind a trail of executions, they also left behind a trail of bankrupt municipalities. The local justices of the peace began to question Matthew Hopkins. They did not just question his theology, they questioned his rates. They asked why it cost so much to do the Lord's work. They asked why the number of witches seemed to multiply exactly in proportion to the amount of money available to hunt them. The spell of the witch-finder general was broken not by a grand intellectual awakening, but by the quiet, stubborn limits of the parish budget. This is the strange, flat reality of historical terror. It rarely ends in a dramatic, cinematic confrontation. It usually ends when the people paying for it decide that the cost has grown too high. The machinery of the witch trials was built on fear, but it was fueled by silver. When the silver ran out, the machinery ground to a halt. The ledgers still exist today, preserved in the county archives. You can run a finger down the columns of numbers. You can see the exact price of a human life in the summer of 1645. It is written in brown ink, sealed with wax, and filed away among the records for the road repairs and the poor relief. From today's view, this looks like a devastating extortion racket operating under the law. From their view, it was the necessary, itemized cost of keeping the dark at bay. And that's what's so chilling.
Wimbish, Essex. The year is 1579. A yeoman farmer named John Cornell stands in a courtroom and dictates a sworn deposition against a woman he has known for years. Listen to what the record shows. He swears that his neighbor, Marjorie Stanton, came to his door one afternoon asking for a small charity, a little yeast to bake her bread. He refused her. He swears that she walked away down the lane, muttering darkly to herself, and that shortly after his livestock began to sicken and die. Another neighbor steps forward and swears that Marjorie had asked him for a small piece of leather, and when he refused, misfortune fell upon his house. And the worst part isn't the dead animals, or the poverty of the woman begging for yeast, or the absolute seriousness of the court taking the statements. The worst part is the distance between their front doors. The person who swore Marjorie Stanton was a witch was not a stranger. It was the man from down the lane who had known her for decades. That
is the part that should keep you awake. Except, of course, tonight we are going to look at it until the dread dissolves into a quiet, profound sorrow. To understand the witch trials, you must understand the claustrophobia of the early modern English village. We often picture a witch hunt as a sudden invasion. We imagine Matthew Hopkins and his searchers riding into town like an occupying army, kicking down doors and dragging away the innocent. But Matthew Hopkins and his searchers only provided the spark. The fuel was already there, stacked high in the center of the parish. The village did not have terror done to it. The village, quietly, did it to itself. In the 16th and 17th centuries, rural life was intensely, unavoidably communal. Houses were built close together. The agricultural fields were often divided into shared strips. You drew your water from the same well as the man who owed you money. You walked to the same small stone church on Sunday to sit beside the woman who had insulted your wife. There was no anonymity, and there was no escape. Within this tight, unyielding geography, ordinary friction was inevitable. A denied charity, a quarrel over a straying pig, a boundary stone moved a few inches in the night. But the society was changing. Before the Reformation, the monasteries had provided a safety net of alms for the poor. By the late 16th century, that system was gone, replaced by a shifting, emerging market economy and the burden of local parish taxes. The old communal bonds were breaking down, replaced by a rising individualism. The wealthier villagers, the yeoman farmers, the tradesmen, were beginning to focus on the accumulation of their own property, and they were beginning to resent the poor who lived among them. This brings us to the devastating social pattern at the heart of the English witch trials, the refusal and the guilt. The women we have already met, Elizabeth Clark sitting on her cold stool in Manningtree, Ursula Kemp with her healing herbs in St. Osytt, they were not targeted by strangers. They were named by the people who lived beside them. They were overwhelmingly older, impoverished women who survived by begging from their neighbors.
Imagine the scene at the threshold, a cold autumn afternoon, the smell of wood smoke and turning leaves. An older woman knocks on the heavy oak door of a prosperous farmhouse. She asks for a cup of milk, or a handful of flour, or a penny of yeast. The farmer, feeling the pinch of a bad harvest and tired of the constant demands on his larder, turns her away. He shuts the door. But as the heavy latch falls into place, the farmer feels a sharp, uncomfortable pang of guilt. Christian charity was the foundation of his faith. He knows he is commanded to help the poor, and he has just denied a starving widow. To protect his own conscience, his mind begins to defend itself. He tells himself that the woman is not a deserving neighbor, but a malicious nuisance. The woman limps away down the lane. Perhaps she is angry. Perhaps she mutters a complaint under her breath. 2 weeks later, the farmer's child falls ill with a sudden, unexplainable fever. The early modern mind cannot tolerate a world where a child can die for no reason. It seeks a cause. And the farmer, still harboring the buried guilt of his refusal, finds the perfect, terrifying answer. The old woman did not just mutter, she cursed him. She is a witch, and she has sent a demon to punish him for his lack of charity. The farmer's guilt is instantly transmuted into righteous victimhood. He is not a bad Christian who refused a widow. He is a loving father under supernatural attack. Once this narrative was formed, it was impossible to dislodge. The accusation did not need proof. That is the hardest part.
The accusation was built on the rock-solid foundation of the accuser's own internal distress, and once the name was spoken aloud, it began to move. We can almost personify the whisper. It is a living thing, slipping under the gaps in the timber frames. It moves from the tavern hearth to the market stall. It crosses the village threshold by threshold. When the witch-finders arrived, they merely provided a legal vessel for the whisper to pour itself into, and then the chain reaction began. Because the courts relied on confessions extracted through exhaustion, the accused were forced to name accomplices. When Elizabeth Clark broke in the watching room, she named Anne West. Anne West lived in the same community. The magistrates would send the constables to Anne's door. Anne, under the same torment, would name another. The accusation moved through the village like a contagion, following the lines of old grudges, unpaid debts, and ancient jealousies. Once the clerk wrote your name in the heavy ledger, the community you had known your entire life closed its doors to you. The men who had bought grain from your husband now sat on the grand jury that indicted you. The women who had helped you deliver your children now served as the searchers who stripped you and looked for the devil's mark. You belonged to the whisper now. This is why the witch trials are so much harder to look at than a simple story of villains and victims. There was no distant tyrant forcing the village to murder its own. The village did it willingly, believing it was doing the right thing. The ordinary people filled the roles. They provided the testimony. They tied the ropes. They drove the carts. They built the machinery out of their own fear, and they fed their neighbors into it.
And then the trials ended. The assize judges packed up their papers. Matthew Hopkins and his men rode away down the muddy lane, carrying their leather purses heavy with silver shillings. The gallows were dismantled, the wood sold back to the carpenter, but the village remained. This is the quietest, saddest part of the history, the part that is rarely depicted in the folklore. What does a community do on the day after it has hanged its own? They had to go on living. The physical geography of the town did not change. The cottages of the executed women stood empty, their hearths cold, the thatch beginning to rot in the winter rain. The surviving families of the accused, the daughters, the sons, the grieving husbands, still had to walk down the same dirt lanes. They had to buy flour from the baker who had testified against their mother. They had to sit in the pews on Sunday, listening to the sermon, sharing the small stone church with the men who had pulled the ducking rope. Imagine the absolute, suffocating silence of the market square in the months that followed. The averted eyes, the quiet shame that slowly replaced the righteous terror. In the damp chill of the evening, the only sound is the slow drip of water from the church roof into a stone basin. Drip, drip, drip. A patient, relentless reminder of the time that cannot be unspooled. The village had amputated a part of itself to cure a phantom infection. In doing so, it left behind a permanent, aching ghost limb. The social fabric of the parish was torn in ways that would take generations to mend. Neighbors who had betrayed neighbors could never truly trust one another again. The paranoia faded, but the damage was cast in the court records and in the empty chairs by the hearth. The tragedy of the English witch trials is not that the devil came to East Anglia. The tragedy is that the devil was not required. The ordinary human capacity for fear, guilt, and self-justification was more than enough to build a gallows. From today's view,
This looks like a community tearing itself apart over petty grievances and displaced guilt. From their view, it was the painful but necessary excision of a rot within the parish. And that's what's so chilling.
Great Staughton, Huntingdonshire, the summer of 1646. A country vicar named John Gall sits in the profound quiet of his parish study. He is surrounded by the heavy, leather-bound theology texts of his era, the air in the small room smelling of old dust, beeswax, and damp paper. Outside his window, the sun is beginning to set over the fields, casting long, quiet shadows across the parish he is sworn to protect. He takes up his pen, dips it into the dark iron gall ink, and writes a pamphlet that will strike the first fatal blow against the witchfinder general. He titles it Select Cases of Conscience Touching Witches and Witchcrafts. Listen to what he wrote. He did not write about demons or theology, nor did he lean on the grand, sweeping rhetoric of the state. He wrote about the ordinary, vulnerable people he saw being destroyed every day. Every old woman with a wrinkled face, a furred brow, a hairy lip, a gobber tooth, a squint eye, a squeaking voice, or a scolding tongue, having a ragged coat on her back, a skull cap on her head, a dog or cat by her side, is not only suspected, but pronounced for a witch. He wrote this because he could no longer stand the cruelty. He wrote this because the men with the bodkins were coming to his county, and he intended to stop them. And the worst part isn't the danger he put himself in, or the anger of the witch-finders, or the fear of his own congregation. The worst part is how entirely, terrifyingly alone he first spoke. Tonight we have walked a very long way in the dark. We have stood in the stifling heat of the courtrooms. We have looked at the cold ledgers of the town chamberlains, and we have seen the terrible, bureaucratic machinery of the English witch trials in full, devastating motion. But we are not going to leave you in the dark. The human record is full of cruelty, but it is never entirely absent of grace. Even in the deepest grip of the panic, when the statutes were merciless and the neighbors were terrified, there were moments where the machinery faltered. There were moments where human decency broke through a system that had been meticulously built to crush it. We have seeded these moments throughout our journey, but now, as the night deepens, we are going to gather them together. We are going to look at 3 small mercies. This is not a chapter of grand, sweeping victories. The terror did not end overnight, and the gallows were not dismantled in a single afternoon. But these 3 quiet acts of resistance are the first true turning of the tide. They are the moments where the darkness begins, slowly, to lift. Let the cold of the pond and the heat of the courtroom fade from your mind. Listen to the slow, steady drip of water outside the window. It is farther away now, softer. Drip, drip, drip. A patient, gentle heartbeat, slowing toward sleep. The first small mercy is the vicar who said no. John Gall was not a modern skeptic dropped into the 17th century. He was a man of his time, and he genuinely, sincerely believed that witches were real. He believed that the devil walked the earth. But he also believed in justice, and when he looked at Matthew Hopkins and John Stern, he did not see holy warriors doing the work of God. He saw extortionists. He saw men who were using the profound fear of the invisible world to torture exhausted, impoverished women for a fee of 20 shillings a town. When Hopkins sent word that he was coming to Huntingdonshire, the region was already paralyzed by fear. The whisper had arrived long before the horses. But John Gall did not wait for the witchfinder to arrive and take control of his parish. He stepped into his plain wooden pulpit on a quiet Sunday morning.
He looked out at the faces of his congregation, the farmers, the tradesmen, the women he had baptized and married, and he preached directly, unequivocally against the campaign. He told his parishioners that the witch-finders were doing more harm than the witches themselves. He challenged the validity of their tests. He condemned the sleep deprivation, calling it exactly what it was, a torment that would make any exhausted soul say whatever was required to find rest. He mocked the swimming test as a superstitious, ungodly cruelty, devoid of scriptural or legal basis. It is incredibly difficult to overstate the profound moral courage of this single act. In 1646, criticizing the witch-finders was an immensely dangerous thing to do. If you defended the accused, the easiest and most effective way for the mob to silence you was to accuse you of being a witch yourself. A clergyman in Suffolk, a man named John Lowes, had already been swum, exhausted, and executed for precisely that reason. But John Gall stood in the pulpit anyway. He did not just preach, he published. His book, Select Cases of Conscience, was printed and bound. It traveled. The physical object of the pamphlet moved from hand to hand, from parish to parish. It was carried in saddlebags and read in candlelight in the studies of other vicars and local justices. He gave the local magistrates the intellectual, theological, and moral cover they needed to start turning the witch-finders away. The first mercy is simply the mercy of one steady voice in a silent, terrified room stating clearly that this is wrong. The second small mercy brings us down from the pulpit and into the muddy, familiar lanes of the village. It is the mercy of the neighbor who testified for, not against. We know all too well that the village turned on itself. We know that the accusations were built on old grudges, denied charity, and the terrible friction of living too close together in a frightened world. But when you read through the surviving handwritten assize records of the era, you will occasionally find a deposition that stops you in your tracks, a document that glows faintly with human warmth. Amidst the pages of angry farmers swearing that their cows were cursed, and frightened parents swearing that their children were pinched by invisible hands, you will find the testimony of a neighbor who simply refused to join the hunt.
Imagine a crowded, suffocating courtroom. A frail, elderly woman stands at the bar. She is shivering, her clothes worn thin, surrounded by the men who have kept her awake for 3 days and 3 nights. The clerk is scratching his pen across the parchment. The magistrate is frowning down from his bench. The whole village is watching from the gallery, their faces hardened by fear and rumor. The whisper has done its work. You belong to the whisper now. But then a man steps forward from the back of the room. He is a local farmer, his hands calloused from the plow, his clothes smelling of turned earth and damp wool. The room goes entirely quiet. He places his hand on the heavy, leather-bound Bible. He swears an oath before God and the king, and then he tells the judge that he has lived next door to the accused woman for 30 years. He speaks slowly, deliberately. He swears that she is a good, quiet, Christian woman. He reminds the court of the deep, brutal winter a decade ago and tells them how she shared her meager flour with his children. He tells the magistrate about the time she sat by his wife's bed, hour after hour, when the sweating sickness came to their lane. He states plainly and for the permanent record that he does not believe she has ever harmed a soul, and he will not stand by and let her be hanged for the death of a pig. These character witnesses did not always save the accused. Often, the bureaucratic machinery of the court simply ground them up alongside the women they tried to protect, dismissing their testimony as the misplaced loyalty of a fool.
But their existence in the historical record is a profound, lasting comfort. They prove that the hysteria was never absolute. They prove that even when the state authorized terror, and the church demanded it, and the community expected it, there were still ordinary people who chose loyalty over fear. To stand beside an accused witch in the summer of 1645 was to risk everything. It risked your social standing, your livelihood, and your own neck. The neighbor who stepped forward knew this perfectly well. He felt the cold stare of the magistrate. He heard the angry muttering of the crowd behind him. He stepped forward anyway. The warmth of a neighbor's hand extended in the darkest possible room is a mercy that time cannot erase. The whisper tried to claim her, but the neighbor refused to let the whisper have the last word. The third small mercy is the judge who doubted. The witch trials were fundamentally a legal process. They were not riots. This meant they required the absolute cooperation of the judiciary to function. As long as the magistrates accepted the swimming test and the prickers and the forced confessions, the gallows remained full and the ledgers remained balanced. But slowly, quietly, a current of skepticism began to flow through the English courts. It did not begin with a grand modern declaration of human rights. It began with the slow, methodical irritation of educated, administrative men who were tired of being made fools of and tired of seeing the law stretched beyond its breaking point.
The accusation did not need proof. That is the hardest part. But eventually, the men sitting on the heavy oak benches began to look at the paperwork, and they began to ask for exactly that. They demanded proof. An assize judge, sitting in a damp county hall after a long, exhausting ride on the circuit, would look at a traveling pricker who claimed to have found the devil's mark on a dozen women. The judge would not just nod and sign the warrant. He would ask to examine the bodkin himself. He would turn the brass handle over in his hands. He would find the hollow shaft. He would find the retracting spring, and he would throw the pricker into the county jail for fraud. These magistrates began to look critically at the confessions gathered under the torment of watching. They began to see the days of forced walking and sleep deprivation not as a legitimate investigation, but as a cruel, illegal physical torture that rendered any resulting confession legally void. They began to look at spectral evidence, the terrifying claim that a witch's spirit had left her physical body to pinch a child in the night, and they began to instruct their juries to disregard it entirely. Imagine the profound, breath-catching relief of that moment in the courtroom. The accusers have told their stories. The village has demanded its blood. The clerk has his pen ready, hovering over the paper. But the judge, a man wrapped in heavy woolen robes who represents the ultimate, unquestionable authority of the crown, leans forward. He looks at the 12 men of the jury. He speaks in the slow, measured cadence of the common law. He tells them that a bad dream is not evidence. He tells them that an old woman mumbling to her cat in the lane is not a capital felony. He tells them that the law requires a standard of physical proof that has not been met in this room today. He issues a reprieve. He orders an acquittal. He brings the gavel down, and the heavy wooden door of the jail is finally opened. The machinery of terror was built on procedure, but it was dismantled by procedure too. The third mercy is the mercy of doubt itself. It is the slow, quiet return of reason to a room that had banished it for years. When the judges began to doubt, the business of witch-finding simply collapsed. The ledger could not be balanced if the product was not accepted by the court.
These three small mercies, the vicar's pen, the neighbor's testimony, the bench's doubt, did not undo the tragedy. They could not turn back the clock. They could not bring back the lives that were lost to the cold mill ponds and the rough hemp ropes, but they are the lights we follow out of the dark. They are the undeniable proof that human decency is a stubborn, resilient thing, and that it can survive the most organized, legislated cruelty the state can invent. As we prepare to leave the damp villages of East Anglia behind us, as the night slowly walks towards the morning, hold on to these three mercies: the pulpit, the neighbor, the bench. They are the quiet, sturdy, unremarkable things that eventually stopped the wheel from turning. From today's view, these look like the bare minimum of human decency, the simplest acts of common sense. From their view, they were dangerous, lonely, profoundly brave acts of rebellion against a terrified world. And that's what's so chilling.
Mistley Heath, Essex, August 1647. A local parish clerk sits alone in a quiet, empty church, a heavy leather-bound register book open on the scarred wooden table before him. He dips his quill into a pot of dark ink and makes a brief, entirely unremarkable entry in the ledger of the dead. Listen to what the record shows. It does not record a grand, sweeping, supernatural battle. It does not record the dramatic fall of a tyrant or the violent overthrow of an inquisitor. It simply notes the burial of a young man dead before his 30th birthday, whose lungs had finally given out to the wasting, exhausting disease of consumption. The man's name is Matthew Hopkins. The clerk sands the wet ink, blows the fine dust away, and closes the heavy book. And the worst part isn't the brevity of the entry, or the profound quiet of the village graveyard, or even the terrible sweeping ruin the young man had caused in his short life. The worst part is the absolute anticlimactic ordinariness of it. The man who sent over 100 souls to the gallows in 14 months was himself dead within 2 years, dying of an ordinary illness, in an ordinary bed, and buried in an ordinary grave. And the country that had feared him, the parishes that had emptied their treasuries to pay his fees, simply moved on. That, in its own way, is the strangest part of all. We are coming to the end of our journey in the dark. The fever has finally broken. The packed, suffocating courtrooms have closed their doors. The traveling judges have ridden back to London, and the heavy machinery of the English witch trials has slowly, inevitably ground to a halt. Tonight, as we walk the last mile of this long, quiet road, we are going to look at how the story actually ended. We are going to look at what faded into the earth and what remains behind. For centuries, folklore has tried desperately to give Matthew Hopkins a different ending. The human mind craves symmetry, and it craves a sense of cosmic justice. Because Hopkins was a man who built his fame and his fortune entirely on the suffering of the defenseless, a legend grew that he was eventually overthrown by his own cruel methods. The story, whispered in taverns and printed in later sensationalized penny books, claims that an angry mob finally turned on the witchfinder general. It claims they accused him of being a witch himself, dragged him to a village pond, and forced him to undergo the swimming test. The legend says he floated, proving his guilt to the crowd, and was hanged on a wooden gallows of his own making. It is a deeply satisfying story. It is a neat theatrical conclusion to a reign of terror, a perfect closing of the circle. But it is entirely false. It is a myth invented later by satirical poets and local storytellers who simply could not accept that history is rarely so poetic and rarely so fair. The truth is far quieter and far more sobering. Matthew Hopkins was never swum. He was never tried by a jury. He was never dragged to the gallows. By the spring of 1647, the tide of public opinion had already turned against him. The soaring municipal costs of his services, the growing documented skepticism of the assize judges, and the brave public opposition of men like the vicar John Gall had made his lucrative business model impossible to sustain. Hopkins quietly retired to his home in Manningtree.
He was already gravely ill with pleural tuberculosis. He spent his final months writing his defensive pamphlet, The Discovery of Witches, coughing his life away in a damp, unremarkable room. And then he simply died. When he was lowered into the earth in the churchyard at Mistley Heath, the great East Anglian witch hunt died with him. John Stern, his slightly older partner, faded quietly into obscurity, writing his own forgotten defense before disappearing from the historical record. The great sweeping panic did not end with a dramatic confrontation. It simply dissolved the way a sudden summer storm exhausts itself and leaves only the wet ground behind. But the end of Matthew Hopkins was not the immediate end of the witch trials as a legal concept. The framework that had allowed him to operate, the harsh 1604 Witchcraft Act signed by King James I, remained firmly on the statute books. For several more decades, sporadic, isolated trials continued across England and Scotland. Women were still occasionally accused by their neighbors. The assize judges still occasionally sat in their heavy robes and heard the depositions of frightened farmers. But the world was profoundly changing. The intellectual climate of Europe was slowly, inevitably shifting from the rigid, terrifying certainties of medieval demonology to the measured, empirical observation of the scientific revolution. The men who wrote the laws were beginning to look at the universe differently. The accusation did not need proof. That is the hardest part. And because it did not need proof, the new generation of legal scholars, philosophers, and educated elites began to find the entire process intensely embarrassing. The men of the late 17th and early 18th centuries looked back at the ducking ponds, the hollow retracting bodkins, and the testimonies of invisible familiars, and they did not see a holy war against the devil. They saw a catastrophic administrative failure. They saw a superstitious, bloody stain on the rationality of the English common law. They began to demand proof that could be physically measured, seen, and verified. They demanded a standard of evidence that the invisible world could never provide. And when they demanded it, the invisible world simply evaporated from the courtrooms. Finally, in 1736, under the reign of King George II, the British Parliament passed a new Witchcraft Act. This statute did not just revise the old laws, it completely dismantled them. It formally repealed both the 1563 Act of Elizabeth I and the deadly 1604 Act of James I. It removed the death penalty entirely. But the most profound shift was in the legal definition of the crime itself. The 1736 Act declared that it was no longer a legal possibility to commit witchcraft. The state officially, formally decided that witches did not exist. Instead, the new law made it a crime to pretend to have magical powers. It became a simple fraud, a con artist's trick, punishable by a minor fine or a year in a local prison.
In a single, quiet stroke of the pen, the state transformed the witch from a supernatural domestic terrorist into a common street corner charlatan. The terrifying, world-ending agent of Satan was reduced to a petty criminal reading palms for copper pennies in a market stall. The fear was legislated out of existence. The long, dark nightmare of the early modern era was officially, legally closed.
And so the great quiet descended over the English countryside. Close your eyes and imagine the small, damp villages of Essex and Suffolk as they stand today, or as they stood a century after the panic had passed. The physical geography of the terror is still there, but it has been softened and worn down by time. The timber-framed cottages have settled deeply into the earth. The muddy, rutted lanes where the witch-finders rode have been paved over. The great stone churches, where the vicars preached their warnings and the frightened congregations prayed for deliverance, still stand in the exact center of the parishes, their bells marking the hours. Walk through the market square of Chelmsford in the fading light. The wooden gallows are gone, dismantled and forgotten centuries ago, the wood repurposed or burned for winter fuel. The mill ponds where the accused were crossbound and thrown into the freezing water have mostly been filled in, planted over with green grass, or reclaimed by the shifting muddy banks of the slow rivers. Listen for the sound that has followed us through the dark, through the watching rooms and the courthouses, the slow, patient drip of water from the eaves. Drip, drip, drip. It is very faint now. It is slowing down, the space between the drops growing longer and longer. It is the sound of the past retreating, washing away the panic, leaving only the quiet stones behind. The stone remembers what the villagers tried so desperately to forget. But the stone is not the only thing that survives. History is not just a collection of formless memories, it is a collection of physical, tangible objects, and the objects of the witch trials are still with us, waiting quietly in the dark. In the hushed, climate-controlled rooms of the county archives and the great national libraries, the paperwork remains. The Essex Assize Court records survive. They are bound in heavy, cracking leather, the thick rag-based paper folded and tied with rough string. The brown iron gall ink is fading into the parchment, but the sweeping, meticulous administrative handwriting of the clerks is still perfectly legible. If you request the boxes, you can sit in the quiet reading room, where the only sound is the turning of a page, and you can run your finger over the exact lines where the depositions were recorded. You can read the names: Elizabeth Clark, Ursula Kemp, Marjorie Staunton. For centuries, these women were reduced to a single, monstrous word. They were stripped of their humanity, their complex lives, their agonizing poverty, and filed away under the category of the damned. But when you look at the physical court records, when you see their names written in the ink of the men who condemned them, you see them again. You see the days they were kept awake in the cold rooms. You see the petty, decades-old grudges of their neighbors. You see the exact, heartbreaking price of their execution tallied in the Chamberlain's ledger, 20 shillings at a time. When a woman was accused in 1645, her identity was entirely stolen by the community's fear. You belong to the whisper now. But today, the whisper has fallen completely silent. The accusers are dead. The magistrates are dead. The witch-finders are dust in the Essex churchyards. Only the records remain. And because the records remain, these women no longer belong to the whisper. They belong to history. They belong to the archive. They are kept safe. And they are remembered. And then there is one more surviving object, resting in the deepest quiet of all. In the rare books room of the British Library, stored carefully in a protective, acid-free enclosure, sits a thin, incredibly fragile pamphlet printed in 1647, The Discovery of Witches. It is Matthew Hopkins' own meticulous defense of his indefensible work. It is a small thing, easily held in the palm of one hand. The paper is dry, the edges are frayed, and the heavy black typography of the early iron printing presses bites deeply into the page, the letters uneven and absolute. It does not scream. It does not smell of wood smoke or damp wool or terror. It sits perfectly still in the dark. It is a physical monument to the danger of absolute certainty. It is the artifact of a time when the state, the church, and the ordinary people of the village all agreed that the world was infested with invisible monsters and that the only cure was the rope. The story of the witch trials is not a story of monsters. It is a story of neighbors. It is the story of how easily and how methodically a society can build a machine to destroy its most vulnerable people, and how calmly it can write the invoices for the destruction. We can look back at them with pity. We can look back at them with horror. But we must look back at them with the profound, unsettling understanding that they were exactly like us. They were frightened. They were desperate. And they believed with their whole hearts that they were doing the right thing. From today's view, this looks like a terrifying, inexplicable madness that consumed an entire era. From their view, it was the necessary, bureaucratic defense of a fragile world. And that's what's so chilling.
London, July 2026. Inside the British Library at St. Pancras, past the heavy glass doors and the security desks, there is a room where the temperature and humidity are perfectly, flawlessly controlled. A researcher sits at a large wooden reading desk. It is profoundly quiet here. The air smells of old paper, of binding glue, and of polished wood, a dry, sweet scent of lignin and dust, preserved perfectly in the filtered air. Outside, the vast modern city moves, buses shifting gears and trains departing the station. But inside this room, time is held perfectly still. For hours we have walked down the muddy, rutted lanes of early modern East Anglia. We have stood in the freezing damp of the village squares. We have listened to the slow, agonizing drip of water from the thatched eaves into the cold mud, the relentless, patient metronome of a terrified world. But listen closely now. The water has finally stopped. There is no rain here. There is no cold. There is only the soft, steady, almost imperceptible hum of the climate control, breathing dry, safe air over the artifacts of the past. A librarian walks softly across the carpeted floor. They place a small gray, acid-free cardboard box onto the wooden desk. The researcher opens it. Inside, resting on a specialized foam wedge designed to protect its fragile spine, is a small, unremarkable-looking book. It is Matthew Hopkins' The Discovery of Witches, printed in 1647. The paper is browned at the edges. It is brittle, requiring the utmost gentleness and clean, dry hands to turn. A soft lead weight, wrapped in velvet, is placed gently on the margin to hold the page open. It looks like nothing more than a discarded, insignificant pamphlet. It is hard to believe that these few ounces of paper, ink, and thread once carried the weight of 100 human lives. But here it is. It has survived the centuries. The arrogant, defensive voice of a 27-year-old witch-finder, a man who believed he was doing the necessary, bureaucratic work of the state, is now trapped forever on these fragile pages. The terror he caused has entirely evaporated, leaving only this dry, quiet husk behind. Beside the pamphlet, resting in a separate, oversized archival folder, are the surviving Essex Assize court records. These are the actual physical documents that passed through the hot, suffocating courtrooms of 1645. The paper is thick, heavy rag parchment. The iron gall ink, once stark and black, has faded to a soft, rusty brown, but the sweeping, meticulous handwriting of the 17th century clerk remains perfectly legible. You can trace your finger down the columns. You can see the exact moments where the village turned on itself. You can read the sworn depositions, the frantic confessions extracted by sheer exhaustion, the impossible lists of familiars. The clerk recorded it all with the dispassionate precision of a man simply doing his job. The accusation did not need proof. That is the hardest part. But as you sit in the quiet of the reading room, looking at the faded ink under the bright, clean lights, a profound and unexpected comfort begins to settle over the pages. The very system that did not need proof, the very bureaucracy that sought to erase these women from the earth, is the only reason we know they existed. The state wrote their names down so it could hang them, but in doing so, it accidentally made them immortal.
We know about Elizabeth Clark, sitting exhausted on her wooden stool, because the clerk wrote her name down. We know about Ursula Kemp and Marjorie Stanton and the hundreds of other vulnerable, ordinary women whose lives were crushed by a frightened society. We do not have their own words. We only have the words their interrogators forced them to say. But we have their names. We have the permanent, physical proof that they lived. In the summer of 1645, when a neighbor spoke your name in the tavern, your life was taken from you. You belong to the whisper now. But in 2026, the whisper is dead. The fear is gone. The magistrates and the witch-finders are dust beneath the Essex churchyards. When we read their names today, in the bright, quiet light of the reading room, the women are finally safe. They do not belong to the whisper anymore. They belong to the record. They belong to us, and they are remembered. From today's view, these pieces of paper look like the terrible blueprints of a terrible madness. From their view, they were the official, necessary ledgers of a society trying to save itself. And that's what's so chilling. But the ledgers are closed now. The history is settled. It is time to leave the archive. The researcher gently closes the book, and the librarian places the gray box back onto the cart. It is rolled away, back into the deep, dark vaults where the past is kept peacefully asleep. We leave the building, stepping out into the ordinary, harmless night of the present day. The long walk is over. The doors are locked. The dark is nothing to be afraid of. Sleep well.